Welcome, curious minds, to the deep dive. Today, we're embarking on a journey into a chapter of history that is as vast as it is, well, harrowing.
It really is.
We're going to pull back the curtain on a figure whose public persona was meticulously crafted for benevolence and progress, yet whose private actions unleashed, unimaginable suffering on an entire continent.
A stark contrast, definitely.
We are, of course, talking about King Leopold II of Belgium and his personal, unfathomably large empire, the Congo Free State.
It's a scale that's almost impossible to truly grasp. Imagine a territory covering more than 2,600,000 square kilometers.
Wow.
That's an area over 85 times the size of Belgium itself. Just think about that.
85 times.
A colossal landmass that a single man managed to claim as his private property, and then proceeded to exploit with a ruthlessness that defies easy comprehension.
Exactly. Our mission for this deep dive is to unpack the intricate web of ambition, economics, and sheer brutality that led to one of history's most devastating yet disturbingly overlooked tragedies.
Overlooked is definitely the word for it in many ways.
We're going to tackle some critical questions head on. How did Leopold, initially presenting himself as this, humanitarian championing civilization, create such a widespread system of human suffering?
Right, the philanthropic mask.
What were the true drivers behind the immense population decline in the Congo Free State, pushing millions to their deaths?
The mechanisms of that decline are crucial to understand.
And why is there still such an intense, often painful debate about whether these atrocities ultimately constitute a genocide? We'll be drawing directly from our sources today to navigate this challenging but absolutely essential history.
Essential is right. Let's get into it.
Okay, so let's begin at the very genesis of this personal empire with King Leopold II himself. It's fascinating and frankly a bit disturbing to learn that his obsession with acquiring a colonial empire wasn't a sudden whim.
Not at all.
Our sources revealed this was a deep-seated ambition that predated his very ascension to the Belgian throne in 1865. What was driving this singular, almost relentless pursuit?
It's true. Leopold's desire for a colony was fervent and consistent. Even as a young prince, he was relentless, tirelessly lobbying Belgian politicians, looking for any opportunity for expansion, whether it was in the Far East or Africa.
So it was always there.
Always. For him, a colonial empire wasn't just about tangible wealth. It was about elevating Belgium's standing, its prestige, its status on the global stage.
Ah, the prestige angle.
He believed a small nation like Belgium needed a vast overseas dominion to truly be considered a significant power. This wasn't just about financial gain, though that was certainly part of it, but a deeply ingrained sense of national and, I think, personal aggrandizement.
But the irony here is that, despite Leopold's fervent desires, Belgium itself, the very nation he was trying to elevate, initially showed little interest in his grand colonial vision. What was the resistance about?
Yeah, that's a key point. Colonization at the time was largely unpopular within Belgium. The politicians and the public viewed it as an incredibly risky venture. Very expensive, financially speaking, and without any obvious or immediate national benefit that would justify such an enormous undertaking. They were much more focused on domestic development, European politics, neutrality.
Right, internal stuff.
Exactly. So, despite Leopold's persistent efforts to persuade them, his numerous attempts to gain state backing met with almost universal resistance.
Which must have frustrated him immensely.
Oh, undoubtedly. This fundamental opposition from his own government is key to understanding his determination to pursue a colonial dream for himself, personally, if the nation wouldn't embrace it. He was not deterred by rejection, he just changed his approach.
And that's precisely where the philanthropic veil enters the picture.
Yeah.
If you can't convince your own government to back a direct colonial enterprise, you find another, more internationally palatable way to legitimize it. What did that look like for Leopold?
This was Leopold's stroke of, cynical genius, you could say. He was inspired by the sensational reports coming out of Central Africa from explorers.
Livingstone and Stanley.
Precisely. Reports which painted it as this vast, rich, but uncivilized continent ripe for intervention. He seized upon this narrative. In 1876, he established what he biblically presented as the International African Association, the Association Internationale Africaine.
It sounds very noble.
On the surface, it sounded incredibly noble, didn't it? A charitable and scientific endeavor. Its stated goals were humanitarian, to oversee the exploration and surveying of the vast Congo River basin, to combat the Arab slave trade, to bring humanitarian assistance, and crucially, to civilize the native population.
Civilized being the operative and loaded word.
Absolutely. But in reality, this was a meticulously crafted deception, a sophisticated smokescreen for his true, purely extractive colonial ambitions. It allowed him to project an image of a benevolent ruler bringing progress while secretly pursuing personal gain. It was brilliant marketing in a grim sort of way.
And to give that veil some undeniable credibility, he brought in the biggest names in exploration, didn't he? Henry Morton Stanley, for instance, who had famously found Livingstone, essentially became his chief cartographer, charting the very river that would become the heart of Leopold's domain.
Absolutely. Stanley's work was utterly instrumental. His extensive travels and detailed mapping of the Congo River basin provided the geographical data and the veneer of scientific legitimacy that Leopold desperately needed.
The maps gave it a sense of reality, of claimability.
Exactly. Stanley, through his expeditions, signed hundreds of treaties with local chiefs, often under dubious circumstances, it has to be said. Misunderstandings, coercion.
I can only imagine.
Effectively ceding vast tracts of land to Leopold's association. This was a crucial step, transforming a vague ambition into tangible claims, laying the groundwork for what would become his personal property. Without explorers like Stanley, his claims at the international level would have been far less credible.
All of these machinations, this cunning blend of ambition, personal funding, and seemingly noble intentions, ultimately culminated in the Berlin Conference of 1884-1885.
The watershed moment.
This was the scramble for Africa in full swing, and it was here that Leopold's personal control over the Congo Basin received its formal international recognition. It's a critical distinction, isn't it? This wasn't Belgium acquiring a colony.
No, absolutely not.
This was Leopold acquiring a personal estate.
It is indeed the most critical distinction, and one that often gets missed. At the Berlin Conference, the European powers, all vying for their own slices of Africa, formally recognized Leopold's personal claim over a staggering 2,350,000 square kilometers, which he named the Congo Free State.
Free State, another loaded term.
Highly ironic given what followed. The primary justifications offered by European leaders were largely self-serving, of course. This vast territory would supposedly serve as a free trade area, ensuring open access for all European commercial interests, and also function as a buffer state, kind of keeping the British, French, and Portuguese spheres of influence in the region nicely separated.
So geopolitical convenience played a huge role.
A massive role. This maneuvering provided the perfect convenient cover, allowing Leopold's highly personal and ultimately predatory enterprise to be sanctioned by the international community under the guise of free trade and humanitarianism. And crucially, without a single African representative present at the conference.
Of course not. So he's got the territories, he's got the international blessing, but our sources highlight that in its initial years, this quasi-colony was far from the cash cow Leopold envisioned.
Not at all. Far from it.
It was, in fact, constantly teetering on the brink of bankruptcy, despite its enormous size.
That's a crucial point that often gets overlooked in the shadow of the later atrocities. The early years of the Congo Free State, from its inception in '85 until the mid-1890s, were financially precarious, really precarious.
Just scraping by.
The administration was perpetually in debt, relying heavily on loans from Leopold himself. His personal fortune was being drained, and the relatively small-scale ivory trade was barely keeping it afloat.
And the actual state presence was thin on the ground.
Surprisingly thin and patchy, yes. In 1900, for instance, sources suggest there were only about 3,000 white people in the entire territory.
In an area 85 times the size of Belgium.
Exactly. And only about half of those were actually Belgian. The administration itself was tiny, numbering somewhere between 700 and 1,500 officials, maybe even less sometimes.
Wow.
These individuals were widely dispersed in small stations along the river and at key strategic points, controlling very little of the vast hinterland directly. This initial fragility, this lack of resources and manpower, meant Leopold was becoming increasingly desperate for a true, reliable source of profit.
And this brings up an interesting, albeit often dark point about African agency, or at least involvement, in the early administration. It wasn't just white officials running the show, was it?
No, not entirely, and it's complex. African chiefs played a significant, if often tragic and coerced, role. They were instrumental, often compelled by force, or perhaps manipulated by incentives, in implementing government orders within their communities.
Caught in the middle.
Completely caught in the middle, between the Free State's demands and their own people's needs and traditions. It's also vital to acknowledge that some of the early violence, particularly in the efforts to consolidate control, wasn't solely down to, say, rogue white administrators acting without explicit state approval, though that certainly happened.
Right.
It could also be attributed sometimes to African groups using the new colonial power structures to settle old scores with rivals or to extend their own power. It's messy.
History rarely fits neat boxes.
Exactly. The initial focus of Leopold's skeletal administration was largely on asserting control, which inevitably meant direct military conflict against African peoples who resisted Free State rule, like the powerful tribes around the Congo River in the southwest or the Azande people in the UALA region in the northeast. This initial period was marked by these brutal pacification campaigns, really setting a grim precedent for what was to come.
Okay, so, as we've established, the Congo Free State, despite its philanthropic pretense, was designed from its very inception to be profitable for Leopold and his investors. The bottom line was always about wealth extraction.
Always. That was the core purpose.
But the initial reliance on ivory exports wasn't enough, leaving the administration perpetually in debt. What was the game changer? What transformed this failing enterprise into an unprecedented money-making machine?
The game changer was natural rubber. Wild rubber. And specifically, the global rubber boom of the 1890s.
Industrialization's demands.
Precisely. With the invention of vulcanization by Goodyear, and then the burgeoning bicycle craze, followed later by the automobile industry, demand for rubber just skyrocketed worldwide.
Right place, right time for Leopold in a twisted way.
Fortuitously, perhaps diabolically for Leopold, the Congo territory was abundantly rich in wild rubber vines, Landolphia owarensis. This massive surge in global demand was the turning point. It abruptly ended the Free State's financial woes and propelled it into an era of almost unimaginable profitability.
So it went from drain to gold mine almost overnight.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
It completely transformed the Congo from a financial drain into a gold mine, or rather a rubber mine, a red rubber mine as it became known.
And with that booming demand, Leopold implemented a radical and, as we'll see, devastating policy shift, the nationalization of land. Our sources emphasize this was a fundamental change.
This was indeed a fundamental and truly devastating policy. In 1891, under what became known as the domain system, the regime domanial Leopold enacted decrees that declared all vacant land.
Vacant meaning?
Well, that was the fiction. It essentially meant all forests, uncultivated areas, and even vast swaths of land traditionally used by indigenous populations for hunting, gathering, shifting cultivation. All of it was declared uninhabited and thus state property.
A legal trick, basically.
A massive legal fiction.
Yeah.
An act of wholesale dispossession. This meant that all natural resources within these areas, most crucially wild rubber and also ivory, now fell under direct colonial ownership, bypassing any traditional land rights or indigenous claims entirely.
Stripping people of their livelihoods and heritage in one go.
Absolutely. It stripped the Congolese people of their ancestral lands and the resources vital not just for their survival, but for their traditional economies and way of life.
And then he took these vast, newly nationalized territories, these crown domains and other concessions, and basically outsourced their exploitation to private companies.
Exactly. He effectively privatized the extraction of wealth and, crucially, human labor. This wasn't just about Leopold's personal domain, though he certainly carved out an enormous portion for himself.
How much are we talking?
He directly controlled a staggering 250,000 square kilometers known as the Crown Domain, the Domaine de la Couronne. That's on top of his pre-existing private domain.
Unbelievable size.
But beyond that, yes, he granted truly colossal concessions to private companies. These companies were often backed by Belgian and international financiers, including Leopold himself sometimes.
Any notorious examples?
Oh, yes. The sources constantly mention the Société Anversoise du Commerce au Congo de Anversoise, which was given control over 160,000 square kilometers, and the Anglo-Belgian India Rebel Company, usually just called ABIR, received a comparably massive territory.
And these companies were just let loose.
That's the chilling aspect of this system. Between roughly 1891 and 1906, these companies were granted virtually free rein. They were allowed to exploit their concessions and maximize profit with minimal, sometimes zero, state interference or oversight. The state essentially became a partner in crime, creating the legal framework for unchecked exploitation and then stepping back to let the companies enforce it, often with their own brutal militias.
So the state provided the justification and the companies did the dirty work.
In many areas, that's exactly how it functioned. The state benefited financially, Leopold benefited personally, and the companies reaped enormous rewards.
And the profitability of this system was absolutely explosive. Our sources provide some truly jaw-dropping figures, like ABR's over 100% turnover on its initial stake in a single year.
Yes, the returns were staggering. It wasn't just profitable, it was, as you said, obscenely so. It's one of the clearest examples in history of how boundless greed can directly fuel unprecedented human suffering.
What about Leopold's personal take?
Estimates suggest Leopold himself, through his crown domain and the state share of profits from the concession companies, amassed a personal fortune of around 70 million Belgian francs between 1896 and 1905 alone.
Which was astronomical then.
Astronomical, equivalent to billions in today's money. He poured this vast personal wealth into lavish public works in Belgium, parks, museums, avenues in Brussels and Ostend, ironically earning him the nickname Builder King back home, while the source of that wealth remained hidden or ignored by many.
The dark side of the Builder King.
Precisely. And the perceived success of the Free State's concession system was so great, financially speaking, that disturbingly, it was soon copied by other colonial regimes across Africa, notably in the neighboring French Congo, right next door.
So it set a terrible precedent.
It illustrated how these brutal, exploitative practices could quickly become normalized, seen as a successful model simply because they generated huge profits. This period makes it chillingly clear. The pursuit of profit wasn't just a driver, it was the fundamental imperative behind the atrocities that followed. Everything else was secondary.
So with rubber established as the primary revenue source, the Congo Free State adopted what critics later, and quite rightly, termed the red rubber system.
A chillingly accurate name.
This wasn't merely a labor policy, it was a system of coercive extraction, demanding labor as a form of taxation. Our sources leave no doubt. The aim was to maximize rubber collection at all costs.
Precisely. The entire system pivoted on forcibly mobilizing Congolese males, primarily males, to collect wild rubber from the forests. This policy effectively created what historians describe as a slave society. Not chattel slavery in the old sense, perhaps, but a society utterly dependent on forced labor.
How did it work in practice?
Companies and state agents became completely dependent on this forced labor. The central administration's demands for rubber quotas were often set arbitrarily, with little to no consideration for the number of available workers in a village, the distance they had to travel into dangerous forests, or their general welfare.
Just a number to be met.
Just a number. And crucially, the pervasive lack of a developed centralized bureaucracy. Remember how few administrators there were meant there was no real oversight of commercial methods. This fostered an atmosphere of informality.
Informality sounds almost benign, but here it wasn't.
Not at all. This informality was not benign. It directly facilitated the rampant abuses we're discussing. There's no effective regulation on how laborers were treated. Everything was left to the unchecked discretion of local officials and company agents on the ground. Individuals often under immense pressure themselves to meet quotas. It created fertile ground for cruelty and depravity.
And some companies became particularly infamous for this unchecked informality and brutality, didn't they? Our sources frequently single out ABR, the Anglo-Belgian India Rubber Company, and the Société Anversoise.
Indeed. The historian Jean Stengers, among others who studied the period closely, described regions controlled by these two concession companies as veritable hells on earth. The conditions were just appalling.
What about compensation for the workers? Was there any?
The compensation for these rubber harvesters, when it existed at all, was not just meager, it was often insulting. Entirely inadequate to sustain life or incentivize labor in any meaningful way. We're talking about things like a few yards of cheap cloth, some glass beads, a small portion of salt, maybe a basic knife, for weeks of dangerous, backbreaking work.
Practically worthless.
Essentially worthless compared to the labor extracted and the value of the rubber collected. And the rubber quotas demanded were often impossible to meet, given the declining availability of rubber vines near villages and the sheer physical toll. Failure to meet these quotas led to unimaginable consequences.
Like the story about the chief.
Yes, there's a deeply disturbing instance, recounted in some sources, where a customary chief was apparently rewarded with slaves for compelling his subjects to gather rubber. It shows how traditional structures were horrifically perverted and integrated into this exploitative system.
The methods of coercion and repression employed to enforce these quotas were truly brutal and systematic. We often hear about the chicote, the whip, but our sources indicate it went far beyond mere physical punishment.
Oh, far beyond. It extended into a realm of pervasive psychological and physical terror. For those who resisted or failed to supply the demanded rubber, routine beatings or whipping with a chicote, which was a heavy whip made of sun-dried hippopotamus hide, designed to inflict maximum pain and tear flesh, were common, almost mundane punishments.
Just routine brutality.
But beyond that, hostage-taking became a widespread and deeply systemic practice. It wasn't occasional, it was policy in many areas. Wives, children, elders, sometimes even chiefs themselves were seized and imprisoned in state or company stockades.
Why? What was the goal?
To ensure prompt rubber collection by their male relatives.
Oh,
If your wife or child was starving in a stockade, you'd go to almost any lengths to meet the quota.
psychological torture.
Exactly. Despite Leopold's vehement public denials that this was official policy, he always denied it. Internal manuals supplied to stations apparently included explicit guides on how to implement this system of hostage-taking effectively.
So the denials were just lies.
Pretty clearly, yes.
Yeah.
Conditions in these makeshift prisons, these stockades, were appalling. The posts at Bungandanga and Mompono, for example, are cited in sources recording shocking death rates. 3 to 10 prisoners per day dying in 1899 due to starvation, disease, neglect, overcrowding.
3 to 10 per day.
Per day in just those locations. Gives you a sense of the scale. And if entire villages resisted or failed to meet quotas consistently,
What happened then?
punitive expeditions were sent out. Armed columns, often forced public soldiers, accompanied by company militia or local auxiliaries, would descend on the village, resulting in its complete destruction. Huts burned, crops destroyed, livestock killed or stolen, inhabitants killed or driven into the forest to starve.
Total destruction.
This policy led to a catastrophic collapse of Congolese economic and cultural life in many areas. Farming became impossible, traditional social structures broke down, it exacerbated famine and suffering immensely.
And who is the primary enforcer of all this brutality? The force public, the colonial military, seems to have been the central pillar of this red rubber system.
The force public, established back in 1885, was unquestionably the backbone of rebel production enforcement. Its very composition is telling of the system's calculated design.
Oh, so.
It was commanded by white officers and non-commissioned officers, mostly Belgian, but also other Europeans, Scandinavians, Italians. But its rank and file, the black privates, were often recruited deliberately from far-flung areas of Africa, places like Zanzibar, Nigeria, Liberia.
Why recruit from so far away?
To minimize local loyalties. Soldiers from distant lands were less likely to sympathize with the local populations they were terrorizing, or they recruited from specific, often rival, local ethnic groups, like the Bangala, which some argue contributed to the spread of the Lingala language as a kind of lingua franca of control and military life.
Pitting groups against each other.
A classic colonial tactic. They even recruited freed slaves from the eastern Congo, often captured during the Congo-Arab War, effectively turning victims of one form of oppression into enforcers of another. By 1900, this force numbered around 19,000 men, a formidable and terrifying presence across the territory.
And the Zappo-Zaps are often singled out as a particularly terrifying component within the force public, aren't they?
They absolutely are. They weren't technically part of the regular force public, but a specially authorized auxiliary force drawn from the Songi ethnic group, sometimes known as Batella auxiliaries too. They had a fearsome reputation.
Why were they so feared?
They were reportedly cannibals, a reputation the administration seems to have done little to discourage, perhaps even exploited. And they frequently abused their official positions to raid the countryside, not just for rubber enforcement, but also for slaves, loot, and general terrorization of communities. Their unchecked brutality amplified the general climate of fear and violence significantly.
So it wasn't just the state military.
No, and that's crucial. In addition to the force public, the various rubber companies, ABIR, Anversoys, and others, also employed their own private militias. These company guards often worked hand in glove with the state military, reinforcing the system of terror and ensuring rubber quotas were met. This comprehensive red rubber system, this nightmare, really emerged with the concession regime in 1891 and persisted with full intensity until around 1906, when international pressure really started to bite. And was concentrated most heavily in the rubber-rich regions, Equateur, Bandundu, and Kasai, leaving a trail of death and devastation in its wake.
A system built entirely on violence and fear fueled by profit.
That's the inescapable conclusion.
This brings us to perhaps the most infamous, most recognizable image of the Congo Free State atrocities, the severed hands. Failure to meet rubber quotas was punishable by death, but this particular mutilation gained a horrifying notoriety. And it stemmed from a very cold, disturbingly calculated economic reason, didn't it?
It did, and it speaks volumes about the utter dehumanization at the heart of the system. Forced public soldiers were issued cartridges for their rifles, modern firearms, which were expensive. And they were required in many districts to account for every single shot fired
Oh.
by bringing back the severed right hand of their victim as proof.
Proof they didn't waste the bullet.
Exactly. The perverse logic behind this was chillingly simple. It was a way to prevent them from wasting expensive ammunition on hunting game for themselves, or perhaps more importantly from the state's perspective, from stockpiling bullets for a potential mutiny or rebellion. Ammunition control through mutilation.
So these severed hands became a literal form of currency or payment, a proof of purchase almost.
In a grotesque way, yes. They became a form of macabre currency or accounting token. They were used to prove kills, sometimes used by soldiers to make up for shortfalls and rubber quotas collected by the villages they oversaw, or as a substitute for a missing forced laborer. Sources even suggest soldiers sometimes received bonuses based on the number of hands collected.
Rewarded for killing.
Rewarded for fulfilling their duty as proven by the hands. It was a ghastly accounting system that reduced human beings to mere commodities, their body parts used as entries in a ledger of terror.
And the eyewitness accounts from the time are truly chilling, bringing this abstract horror into stark human terms. Swamze's oral testimony about Leon Fieves, dubbed the Devil of the Equator, is particularly stark.
It is. Swambe recounted how Fieves, a notoriously brutal Belgian district commissioner in the Equator region, demanded baskets full of severed hands from his soldiers as proof of their efficiency in punishing villages that failed to meet quotas.
Baskets of hands.
Swambe described in harrowing detail how a village that refused to provide rubber would be completely swept clean through violence. He personally witnessed Fieves' soldier, a man named Molili, drown 10 arrested natives by tying them up, attaching large stones to a net, and simply tossing them into the river.
Unbelievable cruelty.
And Swambe's conclusion is heartbreakingly direct, summing up the core economic driver of the torment. Rubber causes these torments. That's why we no longer want to hear its name spoken. It connects the violence directly to the economic demand.
There are other accounts, too.
Yes, many. Another junior officer recounted receiving an order after suppressing a rebellion. Cut off the heads of the men and hang them on the village palisades as a warning, and display the women and children in the form of a cross.
Psychological warfare through atrocity.
Absolutely. Even a Danish missionary, Knud Wilhelm Andersen, documented a soldier's chilling rationale for the brutality. The soldier told him essentially, "Don't take this to heart so much. They kill us if we don't bring the rubber. The commissioner has promised us if we have plenty of hands, he will shorten our service."
Caught in the system themselves, in a way?
In a terrible way, yes.
Mm-hmm.
These accounts reveal a system where human life was utterly devalued, sacrificed for quotas and profit, a direct extension of Leopold's insatiable greed filtering down through the administrative chain.
This really paints a picture of a system where human life was utterly devalued. However, our sources also bring up an important historiographical debate regarding the dismemberment of the living. While the horrifying photographs, those iconic, terrible images of victims missing hands, created a perception of widespread living dismemberment as punishment.
Right, the photos are powerful and shaped public opinion massively.
Historians offer a more nuanced, though no less disturbing, view.
Yes, it's a critical point for historical accuracy, and it doesn't in any way diminish the horror. Historians like David Van Raybroek, Gene Stengers, and Daniel van Groenweg, who've studied the sources very closely, argue that while dismemberment of the living did happen, it likely wasn't a systemic official practice as a direct punishment for failing to meet quotas, i.e., you didn't bring enough rubber, so we cut off your hand.
Yeah. So how did it happen then, mostly?
They suggest that most cases of dismemberment of the living occurred when soldiers, after shooting people during raids or punitive expeditions, cut off their hands, believing them to be dead, when in fact the victims were still alive, perhaps unconscious or dying.
A horrific mistake born from brutality.
Precisely.
Yeah.
There are chilling accounts from survivors who recounted feigning death after being shot to escape further violence. They remained motionless even as their hands were severed by soldiers collecting proof, only to crawl away to seek help after the soldiers departed.
Unimaginable trauma.
This nuance helps us understand the mechanics of the brutality driven by the need to account for ammunition without downplaying its profound, devastating impact or the terror it instilled. The photos are real. The suffering was real, even if the primary intent behind the hand severing wasn't always punitive dismemberment of the living.
And Leopold II's alleged reaction to this specific horror is, in itself, incredibly telling about his priorities, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's widely quoted, though perhaps apocryphal, but it rings true to his character. He reportedly disapproved of the widespread reports of dismemberment reaching Europe.
Out of humanitarian concern.
Unlikely. It seems it was primarily because it generated terrible publicity, damaging his carefully crafted philanthropic image, and, perhaps more cynically, it might have impacted his labor supply. Why maim the workers you need?
The infamous quote.
He is famously quoted as saying something along the lines of, "Cut off hands, that's idiotic. I'd cut off all the rest of them, but not hands. That's the one thing I need in the Congo." Whether he said it exactly like that or not, it reveals his cold, calculated focus on profit and international optics above all else, even in the face of immense, undeniable cruelty. It wasn't the suffering that bothered him most, but the inefficiency or the bad press.
Beyond the infamous severed hands, hostage-taking, as we touched on earlier, was also a systemic method of coercion, despite official denials, and the conditions in these so-called prisons were truly horrific.
Indeed. And this was absolutely systemic, a key tool of control. Every state post or company station maintained stockades, specifically for imprisoning hostages. Men, women, children, elders, even chiefs were taken.
And these weren't proper prisons.
Not at all. Often just makeshift, unsanitary enclosures. Flimsy huts, open pens, lacking basic sanitation, food, water. The conditions were deplorable, leading to incredibly high death rates, as we mentioned. Those figures from Banadanga and Mampono, 3 to 10 deaths per day, speak for themselves. Starvation, disease like dysentery, exposure, they were death traps.
And for those who resisted more actively?
For those deemed recalcitrant or who actively resisted Free State authority, the punishment was often deportation to forced labor camps, like the notorious one at Loureco. Conditions there were equally, if not more, brutal. This systematic hostage-taking was a constant, terrifying presence in daily life for countless Congolese communities, tearing families apart, enforcing compliance through the agonizing suffering of loved ones held captive.
And the violence wasn't solely about rubber collection. There were also significant wars and rebellions as the Free State struggled to consolidate its authority over pre-existing, powerful native states. This wasn't just about economic exploitation, but also political domination.
That's a crucial point. Much of the early and ongoing violence stemmed directly from the Free State's efforts to bring powerful, independent or semi-independent native states and confederations under Leopold's colonial thumb.
Like who?
Well, figures like Nasiri of the Yeka Kingdom in Katanga, the powerful Zande Federation in the northeast, and even the vast Swahili-speaking territory controlled by the influential Arab Swahili trader Tipu Tip in the east. These weren't simply acts of rebellion against rubber quotas. These were often outright wars of conquest and struggles for self-determination against an encroaching foreign power.
So, state building through violence.
Exactly. Conflicts like the so-called Congo Arab War, fought primarily for control of the lucrative ivory and slave trade routes in the eastern Congo, were brutally suppressed by the force public, often using divide and rule tactics. And internal resistance within Leopold's own structures, like the prolonged 4-year Batella mutiny.
What caused that?
It arose primarily from poor conditions, arrears in pay, and harsh treatment of soldiers within the force public itself. But these mutinies also led to enormous casualties, not just among the soldiers on both sides, but also among the civilian population caught in the crossfire or preyed upon by mutinous troops. The Free State was a place of perpetual conflict and brutal suppression, layered on top of the economic terror.
Perhaps one of the most hidden horrors, and one that deeply resonates, is the creation of child colonies. It sounds almost innocuous, doesn't it? But the reality was anything but.
This was particularly devastating and speaks to the comprehensive cradle-to-grave nature of the exploitation. The Free State administration sanctioned the systematic kidnapping or perhaps collection of orphaned Congolese children.
Often orphaned by the regime's violence.
Very often, yes. Children whose parents were killed in raids or died from famine or disease caused by the system. These orphaned children were then forcibly sent to Catholic missionary schools.
Why Catholic schools specifically?
These were the only schools that received any state funding, effectively making them state-sanctioned institutions for indoctrination and, ultimately, creating a future workforce and military pool.
So, grooming them for service.
Essentially, yes. The children were trained as future workers for the state or companies, or, chillingly, as soldiers for the force public. A pipeline of labor and enforcers raised entirely within the colonial system.
And the conditions in these colonies?
Appalling. Mortality rates in these child colonies were shocking. Sources suggest over 50% of the children sent to these schools died from disease, things like sleeping sickness, dysentery exacerbated by terrible conditions, malnutrition, and lack of proper care.
Half of them died.
At least. and thousands more perished during the brutal forced marches, often over vast distances, to reach these distant colonies. There's one horrifying example cited. Of 108 boys sent on foot to a mission school at Boma, only 62 survived the journey, and 8 of those survivors died within a week of arrival.
It's just staggering.
It was a state-sponsored system of child abduction, forced assimilation, and forced labor that amounted to a slow, agonizing death sentence for thousands upon thousands of vulnerable children.
And it wasn't just Congolese people exploited for labor. Other nationalities were brought in for the grueling railway construction, experiencing similarly horrific conditions.
Yes, the construction of the Matadi-Leopoldville Railway was absolutely crucial for Leopold. It was needed to bypass the rapids on the lower Congo River and transport resources, rubber, ivory from the interior down to the Atlantic coast for export.
A massive engineering challenge.
Immense. And it demanded huge amounts of labor. When local Congolese labor proved insufficient, perhaps due to the population decline or resistance, Leopold imported foreign workers.
From where?
For example, records show 540 Chinese laborers were brought in. But their experience was horrific. 300 either died from disease and accidents or simply absconded, unable to endure the conditions. People from the British West Indies, from Barbados and Jamaica, were recruited. Workers from other parts of Africa, like Sierra Leone and Liberia, were also brought in.
And their fate.
Equally horrifying mortality rates. One source estimates that 3,600 of these Caribbean and other African laborers died in just the first 2 years of construction alone.
3,600. How?
From railway accidents, lack of proper shelter and sanitation, severe flogging by overseers, hunger, and rampant disease like malaria and dysentery. This underscores the systemic nature of the exploitation. The system was brutal and indifferent to the lives of anyone caught in its grip, regardless of their origin, as long as the profit flowed.
Finally, a deeply disturbing aspect of this period is the role of cannibalism. Our sources indicate it was present in parts of the Free State before colonial rule, but the administration's actions seemingly exacerbated, or at the very least, tolerated it, turning a blind eye, didn't they?
It's a very distressing and uncomfortable detail, but one the sources address. While it's acknowledged that ritual or warfare-related cannibalism did exist in some localized areas of the vast Congo Basin before the Free State's establishment, the colonial administration appeared to do very little to suppress it.
They didn't try to stop it.
In fact, there is significant evidence suggesting they sometimes tolerated or even implicitly encouraged it, particularly among their auxiliary troops and allies, like the Zapo-Zaps we mentioned earlier.
As a tool of terror.
Possibly as a tool of terror, or simply because it served their purpose in subjugating rebellious populations. During the brutal Congo Arab War, for instance, there were widespread reports, often from missionaries, of the Batella allies of the forced public cannibalizing defeated combatants.
And official reactions.
Disturbingly, there's a quote attributed to a young Belgian officer, Charles Lemaire, describing the consumption of victims' bodies after a brutally suppressed rebellion. He reportedly called it horrible, but exceedingly useful and hygienic.
Useful and hygienic.
It suggests a chilling level of detachment, and perhaps even seeing it as a practical way of disposing of bodies or intimidating survivors. While cannibalism was officially outlawed within the force public itself, commanders on the ground implicitly, or sometimes even explicitly, allowed their soldiers and local allies to kill and eat captives, including, according to some accounts, non-combatants like infants and old women, especially during punitive expeditions against villages that failed to meet rubber quotas.
So official policy versus de facto reality.
Exactly. This tolerance or even strategic exploitation of such practices adds another layer to the unspeakable horrors inflicted upon the Congolese people, reflecting a complete moral collapse under the relentless pressure of the profit imperative. It's hard to fathom.
So we've outlined the various insidious mechanisms of brutality and exploitation that defined the Congo Free State. What is absolutely clear and largely undisputed among historians is that there was a dramatic and catastrophic reduction in the Congolese population during Leopold's rule.
Undisputed, yes. The scale is debated, but the fact of a massive decline isn't.
This wasn't just a natural fluctuation or a typical consequence of colonization, but a direct, abnormal consequence of the specific colonial practices we've discussed.
That's the crucial point. There is general consensus on a dramatic population decline, and importantly, historians stress that this reduction was atypical, even by the brutal standards of colonialism elsewhere, and directly attributable to the direct and indirect effects of Leopold's specific system of rule.
How do we begin to understand the causes? It seems complex.
It is complex, and the causes are interconnected. The historian Adam Hochschild, in his influential book King Leopold's Ghost, offers a particularly useful framework for understanding this multifaceted catastrophe. He points to a deadly combination of factors, which broadly murder, encompassing the direct violence from wars, rebellions, the brutal enforcement of labor policies, those punitive expeditions we talked about, then starvation, exhaustion, and exposure resulting from the grueling forced labor, the destruction of agriculture, the flight of refugees, the horrific conditions, then critically, disease. And finally, linked to all of these, a plummeting birth rate.
And these factors didn't operate in isolation.
Not at all. They interacted in a vicious cycle, each amplifying the other's effects, creating a perfect storm of destruction and suffering.
Let's break those down, starting with disease, which our sources highlight as perhaps the main direct cause of the decline in terms of sheer numbers, massively exacerbated by the social disruption inherent in the system.
Disease was indeed the primary direct killer, according to most analyses. The systemic disruption caused by the Free State's atrocities, the constant forced labor, the mass movements of populations fleeing violence or being forcibly relocated, the appalling living conditions in villages and labor camps, the collapse of traditional agricultural practices leading to malnutrition, all this created incredibly fertile ground for epidemics to spread like wildfire.
What kind of diseases are we talking about?
Well, specific diseases like African sleeping sickness, spread by the tsetse fly, had an absolutely devastating impact. One estimate suggests around 500,000 Congolese might have died from it in 1901 alone.
500,000 in 1 year from one disease.
It's an almost unthinkable figure, but it gives a sense of the scale. Smallpox was another huge killer, erupting in devastating epidemics. Swine influenza reportedly killed maybe 5% of the entire population in one wave. Amoebic dysentery was rampant, with horrific mortality rates in endemic areas, sometimes 30 to 60%. And venereal diseases like syphilis and gonorrhea also spread rapidly, impacting fertility and general health.
And the colonial system itself helped spread these.
Absolutely. The disruption of previously somewhat isolated rural populations, the constant movement of indigenous soldiers, porters, and refugees across the country, as Raphael Lemkin, who famously coined the term genocide, argued helped spread localized outbreaks into widespread epidemics. People weakened by hunger and brutality had little resistance.
Lemkin connected troop movements to disease spread specifically.
Yes, in his unpublished work on the Congo, he specifically noted how the movement of indigenous soldiers employed by the state, who traversed the country and often had sexual encounters in many different places, served as vectors, spreading diseases like sleeping sickness and venereal infections across much larger areas than might otherwise have occurred.
It's a grim illustration of unintended consequences on top of intentional brutality.
And historian Jan van Sina estimated that 5% of the Congolese population perished just from swine influenza, while in areas where amoebic dysentery became endemic, potentially between 30 and 60% of the population could die, effectively wiping out entire communities.
And alongside disease, famine played a significant intertwined role, directly linked to the forced labor system and the breakdown of traditional life.
Absolutely intertwined. The forced labor system, as we discussed, pulled able-bodied men, the primary agricultural workers in many Congolese societies, responsible for clearing new land from their villages for weeks or months at a time. They were collecting rubber, acting as porters, fighting.
So no one was left to farm properly.
It severely hampered agriculture. Women were often left to try and cultivate worn-out fields near the villages, leading to drastically lower yields and nutrient depletion in the soil. They couldn't clear new, more fertile land further afield without the men's labor.
And the soldiers made it worse.
Definitely. The constant presence of company sentries and forced public soldiers in the villages meant that what little food was grown or livestock kept was frequently stolen or confiscated to feed the troops, or simply out of malice. This aggravated existing food shortages and systematically destroyed the local economy and food security.
Are there records of this?
Oh yes. Missionary records from the period frequently describe terrible famine in the concession areas, particularly those run by ABIR. They paint pictures of skeletal figures roaming the landscape, entire villages starving. And of course, malnutrition and outright starvation severely reduced people's immunity to those diseases we just talked about.
The vicious cycle again.
Exactly. Hunger made people vulnerable to illness, and illness prevented them from working the land or foraging for food. It was a catastrophic feedback loop.
And then there's the direct violence itself, the murder, the wars, the brutal suppression of rebellions, and the daily violence used to enforce labor policies, all contributing to this catastrophic decline, though perhaps not as the single largest cause when compared to disease in terms of pure numbers.
That's the complex part. While disease might have been the primary direct killer in terms of sheer numbers in many regions, the violence was the engine of the suffering. It created the conditions for disease and famine to flourish. It drove people from their homes, destroyed their livelihoods, and instilled constant terror.
How do historians quantify the impact of direct violence?
It's very difficult. Some detailed local studies, like Jan Vansina's work on the Kuba and Keet peoples in the Kasai region, suggested that direct violence, actual killings, might have accounted for less than 5% of the total deaths in those specific areas during the rubber boom period.
Less than 5%. That seems low given the stories.
It does, and that figure is often debated. It's incredibly hard to separate direct killings from the deaths caused by the resulting starvation, exposure, or disease contracted while fleeing violence. Furthermore, as the historian Roger Anstey noted, strong oral traditions passed down within Congolese communities often hold the rubber policy itself, with its inherent violence, forced labor, and terror, as a greater cause of death and depopulation than even the devastating sleeping sickness or smallpox epidemics that swept through.
So the lived experience emphasizes the system's brutality overall.
Precisely. It highlights the difficulty, maybe the impossibility, of neatly separating direct violence from its indirect yet equally deadly consequences. The entire exploitative system was predicated on brutal force, and its effects radiated outwards.
And finally, a plummeting birth rate, the tragic result of this combined onslaught of violence, disease, and famine.
Yes, the sheer scale of suffering, the constant threat of violence and abduction, the debilitating impact of endemic and epidemic diseases, and the pervasive starvation all combined to significantly reduce birth rates across the Congo.
How so?
Women were less likely to conceive under such extreme duress and malnutrition. Pregnancies were more likely to end in miscarriage or stillbirth, and infant and child mortality rates soared due to malnutrition, disease, and lack of basic care. The population's natural growth rate simply collapsed. It fell dramatically below the death rate, which was already soaring. This led to a profound demographic catastrophe, a hollowing out of the population.
But again, some nuances.
Right. It's important to remember, as Vansina also observed, that pre-colonial societies in the region often had naturally high birth rates and high death rates, with sometimes significant population fluctuations due to local factors like drought or localized warfare. He even found in his later, more detailed work on the Kuba Kingdom that their population seems to have actually seen a slight rise in the first 2 decades of Leopold's rule, perhaps due to the suppression of some local conflicts, before declining sharply by about 25% between 1900 and 1919, primarily due to sickness, especially sleeping sickness.
So the impact wasn't uniform across the entire vast territory.
Likely not. Vansina specifically cautioned against generalizing figures from the most heavily exploited rubber provinces, the hells on earth, like the ABR concessions, to the entire vast and diverse Congo territory. This complexity doesn't diminish the scale of the tragedy in the exploited areas, but it does inform our understanding of its varied impact across different regions and time periods.
Which leads us to the incredibly challenging and highly contentious topic of the elusive death toll. Our sources confirm there was a dramatic and abnormal reduction, but the actual numbers themselves are widely disputed. Why is it so hard to get a firm figure?
The fundamental problem is a critical lack of reliable data. Specifically, there were no colony-wide census records taken at the beginning of the Free State's rule in 1885. The first reasonably comprehensive official census was only conducted in 1924, nearly 2 decades after the Free State had been abolished and replaced by the Belgian Congo.
So no baseline to compare against.
Exactly. Without a reliable starting number, any calculation of population change involves a significant amount of estimation, projection, and interpretation of often patchy or localized data. This makes precise demographic calculations incredibly difficult and inevitably subject to debate in varying methodologies.
What kind of estimates were being made at the time?
Contemporary observers, particularly those involved in the reform campaigns like Edmond de Morel, often threw out huge numbers based on anecdotal evidence and perceived devastation. Morel himself spoke of maybe 20 million souls initially, suggested perhaps half the population perished. But these were often educated guesses intended to shock the public conscience.
And modern estimates, what's the range?
Modern scholarly estimates vary dramatically, which reflects the data problem. They range from a more conservative figure of maybe 1.5 million excess deaths attributable to the regime.
Which is still enormous.
Absolutely enormous, all the way up to estimates as high as 10 million or even 13 million in some earlier calculations.
Can you give us a sense of who proposed which figures?
Certainly. Roger Casement, the British consul whose 1904 report was so damning, tentatively suggested a population fall of 3 million based on his observations, though he readily admitted it was likely an underestimate. Popular historical accounts, like Peter Forbath's The River Congo, suggest at least 5 million deaths. John Gunther, in the 1950s, cited a range of 5 to 8 million. Raphael Lemkin, as we mentioned, controversially posited that maybe 75% of the population was killed, though his methodology for reaching that figure is unclear and generally not accepted by demographers.
What about more recent demographic work?
More recently, in 2020, the Belgian demographer Jean-Paul Sanderson conducted a study using various demographic models and decline scenarios. He concluded that the population decline was most likely in the range of 1 to 5 million people, considering a figure of around 1.2 million excess deaths to be the most likely based on the available, albeit limited, data and plausible mortality rates.
But there are also significantly higher estimates that many find compelling, often cited in popular histories.
Yes, there absolutely are. Scholars like Adam Hochschild and an earlier Jan van Sina, based on his preliminary research, used an approximate working figure of around 10 million deaths. They often drew support from their examination of local sources suggesting massive depopulation in specific areas, and also pointed towards a 1919 Belgian Government Commission report, which itself suggested that roughly half the population might have perished in the main rubber-producing provinces during the Free State era.
Ndewell.
The noted Congolese historian Isidore Ndewell initially, in the late 1990s, estimated the loss as high as 13 million, based on comparing potential pre-colonial populations with the 1924 census. He later revised this figure down somewhat, closer to 10 million, acknowledging the uncertainties.
But van Sina revised his own estimate downwards later.
Yes, and this is critical. Jan van Sina, a giant African history, later significantly revised his own earlier stance. Based on more detailed, localized research, like his Cuba study, he largely discarded the 10 million claim as lacking solid proof. He found the demographic picture was more complex and varied regionally, and specifically cautioned against extrapolating the catastrophic figures from the worst-hit rubber provinces to the entire Congo territory. His later work emphasizes disease as the main killer in the areas he studied closely.
This sounds like a classic minimalist versus maximalist debate within historical scholarship. It sounds very charged.
It is, and it's often a highly sensitive and contentious area, unfortunately sometimes politicized. Works that cite the highest numbers, 10 million or more, are sometimes criticized by demographic historians as being wild or unsubstantiated, lacking concrete demographic proof that can be rigorously verified.
And the counter-criticism.
Conversely, authors who highlight the inherent lack of reliable demographic data and thus offer lower, more cautious estimates, like Sanderson's 1.2 million most likely figure, are sometimes labeled minimalists or even revisionists. They might be accused, sometimes unfairly, of attempting to downplay or minimize the scale of the atrocities and the immense human suffering involved.
So, navigating this is tricky.
Very tricky. This ongoing tension highlights the immense complexity, the data limitations, and the profound sensitivity involved in trying to quantify such an immense human tragedy decades later. What is not disputed by any serious historian, however, regardless of the precise number they favor, is the undeniable fact of a catastrophic, abnormal, and human-caused population decline directly resulting from Leopold II's brutally exploitative rule. The why of this mass death is fundamentally linked to the relentless pursuit of profit and the systemic violence used to achieve it. The exact number is debated, the horror is not.
Given the sheer scale of human suffering we've described, the systemic brutality, the millions dead, it's almost inevitable that an international outcry eventually emerged. It couldn't stay hidden forever.
No, eventually the truth started to leak out, despite Leopold's efforts.
Our sources point to some pivotal figures and moments that finally pierced through the veil of secrecy and forced the world, or at least parts of the world, to acknowledge the horrors unfolding in the Congo. Who were the early voices?
One of the first major international protests came surprisingly early, actually, back in 1890. It came from an American named George Washington Williams.
An interesting figure.
A fascinating figure. He was a Black American journalist, historian, pastor, and politician who had actually traveled to the Congo himself, hoping to see progress. Instead, he was utterly horrified by what he saw firsthand.
And he spoke out.
He did. He published a powerful, detailed, open letter directly to King Leopold II. And crucially, in that very letter, he used the phrase crimes against humanity to describe the horrific conditions, the exploitation, the violence he witnessed. It's one of the earliest known uses of that specific term in relation to state-sponsored atrocities.
Crimes against humanity in 1890. That's remarkable.
It is. Though his protest didn't immediately change policy, it planted a seed. Public interest really started to surge from about 1895 onwards. There was a particularly egregious event known as the Stokes Affair.
What was that?
Charles Stokes was a British trader, an Irishman actually, operating in the eastern Congo. He was accused, possibly falsely, of selling guns to Arab Swahili forces resisting the Free State, and he was summarily arrested and hanged by a Free State officer without a proper trial. This caused a major diplomatic incident with Britain.
An affront to British justice.
Exactly. That, combined with increasingly detailed reports from missionaries about widespread mutilations, especially the severed hands, finally began to reach European and American publics through newspapers and pamphlets. This gradually made the Congo question a prominent international issue that could no longer be completely ignored.
Leopold, ever the master manipulator of public opinion, tried to manage this mounting international pressure, didn't he? He made some defensive moves to appease public opinion, a classic damage control strategy.
He absolutely did. He was acutely aware of his public image and the growing criticism, particularly in Britain and the U.S. He instigated something called a Commission for the Protection of Natives in 1896.
Sounds good on paper.
It sounded good. It was composed mainly of foreign missionaries operating in the Congo, a seemingly benevolent gesture. He also later invited experts from the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine to come to the Congo to study and combat diseases like sleeping sickness.
Trying to show he cared about welfare.
Precisely. These were largely cynical attempts to deflect criticism, to shift the blame for the high death rates onto natural causes like epidemic smallpox, sleeping sickness, rather than his brutal forced labor system. It was about creating the impression that he cared about Congolese welfare and was taking steps, rather than enacting any substantive, meaningful reforms to the core exploitative system itself. It was all about managing the optics.
But despite his efforts, the campaign for reform gained real, undeniable momentum, especially under the relentless leadership of the British activist E.D. Morel. He seems pivotal.
Morel is arguably the central figure in bringing down the Free State. He was initially a shipping clerk working for Elder Dempster, a Liverpool company that had the shipping contract for the Congo Free State.
So he saw the trade firsthand.
He saw the manifests. He noticed something odd. Ships were arriving from the Congo laden with valuable cargo, primarily rubber and ivory, but they were returning carrying almost nothing of value, mainly guns, ammunition, military supplies.
No real trade goods going back in.
Exactly. He deduced correctly that this wasn't free trade at all, but a system of pure extraction based on forced labor. This discovery horrified him, and he quit his job to become a full-time investigative journalist and activist.
A huge personal risk.
A huge risk. He became a tireless campaigner, launched what became a powerful global movement for Congo reform. His influential 1906 book, Red Rubber. The story of the rubber slave trade flourishing on the Congo in the year of grace 1906 reached a mass audience and unequivocally galvanized public opinion against Leopold, particularly in Britain and America.
And he wasn't alone.
No, he was joined by other prominent figures whose voices carried immense weight. People like Mark Twain, who wrote a scathing satirical pamphlet called King Leopold's Soliloquy. Joseph Conrad, whose haunting novella Heart of Darkness was deeply inspired by his own traumatic time working as a steamboat captain on the Congo River years earlier. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, also lent his considerable theme to the cause, writing The Crime of the Congo. And importantly, there were allies within Belgium too, particularly Belgian socialists who opposed Leopold's autocratic rule. So literary and political pressure combined.
Yes, and official pressure too. The political pressure escalated significantly. In 1903, the British House of Commons passed a resolution condemning the abuses in the Free State. This led directly to the British Foreign Office commissioning their consul in the Congo, Roger Casement, to investigate.
Casement's report, that was crucial, wasn't it?
Absolutely crucial. Casement, an Irishman later executed by the British for treason during World War I, traveled extensively through the Upper Congo in 1903. His detailed, meticulously documented report, published in 1904, confirmed the widespread and systematic nature of the abuses the other. The forced labor, the hostage-taking, the mutilations. It was devastatingly credible and had a huge impact internationally.
Even Leopold couldn't ignore that.
It became impossible to ignore. Under intense international pressure, even Leopold was forced to appoint his own commission of inquiry in 1904 to investigate the allegations. To his likely dismay, this commission, despite being appointed by him, largely corroborated the findings of Casement and the missionaries in its 1905 report. It confirmed the atrocities, although it tried to downplay Leopold's direct responsibility. This only intensified the pressure on the Belgian government itself to intervene and take over the colony from its king.
It's important to clarify that these campaigning groups, like Morel's Congo Reform Association, weren't necessarily anti-colonialism in general, were they? Their goal was very specific.
That's a crucial distinction, yes. These reformers, including Morel and Casement, generally did not oppose colonialism itself as a concept. That was the dominant political ideology of the era, sadly. Instead, their specific objective was to end the unique, unchecked excesses and the sheer barbarity of Leopold II's personal rule and the concession system in the Congo Free State.
How did they propose to do that?
By encouraging, or rather pressuring, the Belgian parliament to formally annex the territory from Leopold. This was seen as the most practical solution.
Why annexation by Belgium?
It was seen as a way to curb Leopold's unchecked personal power and bring the administration under some form of parliamentary oversight and hopefully international accountability. For the British government, it was also seen as a way to resolve the crisis without completely upsetting the delicate balance of power between European colonial powers on the African continent. They believed, or hoped, that direct state control by Belgium, with its established laws and bureaucracy, would inevitably lead to more humane governance compared to Leopold's purely private, profit-driven, and unaccountable enterprise. Their immediate aim was reform and transfer of power, not the abolition of empire in the Congo.
And as a direct result of this sustained international pressure, both moral and political, Belgium formally annexed the territory in November 1908.
That's right. Leopold was forced to relinquish his personal control,
creating the Belgian Congo. Our sources indicate that conditions for the indigenous population improved dramatically after 1908, but there was also, perhaps unsettlingly, a degree of continuity, even under Belgian state rule.
Yes, it's a mixed picture. Conditions for the indigenous population certainly did improve significantly in many respects, especially regarding the most egregious abuses of the Red Rubber era. The overt system of forced labor for rubber and ivory collection was largely dismantled, though not entirely abolished everywhere immediately. The most horrific practices, like systematic mutilations and mass killings as policy, largely ceased under Belgian state control.
So a definite improvement.
A definite improvement from the absolute nadir of the Free State. However, there was also significant continuity. Many former Free State officials, individuals who had directly participated in or overseen the atrocities of the Leopoldian era, were simply retained in their posts within the new Belgian colonial administration. There was no real purge or accountability process for past crimes.
So the personnel often remained the same.
Often, yes. And while direct forced labor for private companies was suppressed, the Belgian colonial administration introduced new, arguably more subtle but still deeply coercive, systems of control and labor extraction.
Like what?
A key instrument was the introduction of a head tax, payable only in cash. Since most Congolese people lived outside the cash economy, this effectively forced them to seek work for European employers in the burgeoning mines, on plantations, or in public works projects, simply to earn the money needed to pay the tax and avoid punishment, which could include imprisonment or forced labor.
Forced into the wage economy.
Exactly. Additionally, the Belgian administration maintained the system called corvée labor, which required Congolese men to provide a certain number of days of unpaid labor per year for state infrastructure projects, like building roads, railways, or government buildings. So, while the most visible and brutal forms of exploitation shifted, a different but still deeply coercive system of labor extraction remained firmly in place, maintaining a fundamental continuity in the unequal colonial relationship. The exploitation just took a different, more bureaucratic form.
And this brings us to the central, most contentious question in the historiography of the Congo Free State. Do the atrocities committed there constitute genocide? It's a question that still sparks intense debate.
It really does. It's perhaps the most sensitive and debated aspect of the legacy.
Our sources engage directly with this open debate, starting with the universally recognized UN's 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide definition. Can you remind us of the core of that definition?
The UN definition is absolutely crucial here, as it provides the standard legal and academic framework. It defines genocide as certain acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group.
The key phrase there being?
Intent to destroy. That specific intent, the mens rea, the guilty mind, is the pivotal component that distinguishes genocide from other mass atrocities or crimes against humanity, however horrific they may be.
So how do most historians specializing in this period apply that definition to the Congo Free State?
The majority consensus among mainstream historians who specialize in this period, including prominent names like Georgie Verbeek, Rhoda Howard Hassman, Adam Hochschild, Georges Nzongola Ntalacha, David Van Raybroek, Barbara Emerson, Jean Stengers, and the later Jan van Sina, is largely to argue against applying the term genocide in its strict legal sense to the Congo Free State case.
Why? What's the basis for that argument?
They primarily point to the crucial lack of clear, explicit evidence demonstrating a deliberate policy of extermination on Leopold's part, or an intent to physically eliminate a specific national, ethnic, racial, or religious group as such. The motivation, they argue, was overwhelmingly economic exploitation, not racial annihilation.
So if they don't categorize it as genocide, how do they characterize the atrocities and the mass deaths that occurred? What language do they use?
They primarily view the catastrophe as the horrific, inevitable consequence of what Van Raybroek called a perfids, rapacious policy of exploitation. They see it as a system driven by an insatiable greed for money that, as Barbara Emerson put it, simply led things to get out of control in the pursuit of profit, with human life treated as utterly disposable, but not targeted for elimination per se.
Any specific terms they use?
Georges Nzongola Ntalacha, a prominent Congolese historian, termed the death toll as being of Holocaust proportions, due to its sheer scale, but he still maintained it was not a genocide in the strict sense because the intent was different. Adam Hochschild himself, whose book brought this history to such a wide audience, called it one of the most appalling slaughters known to have been brought about by human agency, but explicitly stated repeatedly that it was not a case of genocide in the strict sense due to that absence of documented exterminatory intent against a specific group.
He even objected to his work being labeled as about genocide.
Yes, he specifically criticized newspapers and reviewers for mislabeling his work with the term genocide, feeling it misrepresented the historical reality as he understood it. This reflects a fairly broad, scholarly consensus that while the death toll was catastrophic and intentional brutality was absolutely pervasive, the primary intent driving the system was maximizing profit through ruthless exploitation, not the deliberate annihilation of a defined group.
But there are compelling arguments for using the term genocide, especially when considering the scale of the horror and perhaps a broader interpretation of the UN definition's wording.
Yes, there absolutely are, and these arguments deserve to be carefully considered and are put forward by respected scholars. Some, like the historian Timothy J. Stapleton, argue for using the term genocide almost descriptively, purely based on the sheer horror and the massive death toll, believing the term, regardless of strict legal definitions, best conveys the magnitude and severity of the crime committed against the Congolese people.
Are there arguments based more closely on the UN definition?
Yes. Robert Weisbord, for instance, has argued that the UN definition doesn't necessarily require intent to exterminate all members of a population. He suggests that an endeavor to eliminate a portion of a people, targeting specific communities for destruction, perhaps those who resisted most fiercely, would qualify under the in whole or in part clause of the definition. And he asserts the Free State's actions, particularly the punitive expeditions that wiped out entire villages, clearly did this, thus meeting the criteria.
Who else argues for the genocide label?
Other prominent scholars, including Jean Haskin, the Congolese scholar Yelenjimi Mangemi, and the historian and broadcaster David Olusoga, also use the term genocide in their analyses of the Congo Free State. Most notably, perhaps, Raphael Lemkin himself.
And the man who coined the word genocide.
The very same. Lemkin, in an unpublished manuscript written in the 1950s, long after he developed the concept following the Holocaust, explicitly asserted that the Congo Free State represented an unambiguous genocide. That carries significant weight, obviously.
But even Lemkin's assertion, powerful as it is, comes with a complex and, for many, an uncomfortable layer to his specific argument, doesn't it? As mentioned in the outline.
It does, and it highlights the painful complexities and sometimes problematic nature of even early genocide studies. While Lemkin unequivocally asserted genocide in the Congo case, he controversially attributed the primary agency for the violence not necessarily to the Belgian state's direct orders from Brussels, but rather to what he characterized as the savagery of African colonial troops and the native militia, whom he described as cannibals.
So he blamed the African soldiers.
He emphasized that the atrocities were usually committed by Africans in the Belgians' pay, effectively shifting a significant portion of the blame onto the colonized population themselves, framing it almost as inherent savagery unleashed by colonialism, rather than a direct policy dictated by Leopold or his administration. This adds a deeply problematic racial dimension to his specific argument, one that modern historians must critically grapple with, even while acknowledging his overall conclusion.
Other arguments for genocide.
Adam Jones, another genocide scholar, points to evidence like the stark underrepresentation of adult males and subsequent population figures in heavily affected areas as potential evidence of targeted killing, suggesting patterns consistent with outright genocide against resistors or potential future threats.
So the debate continues.
Absolutely. It remains a highly contentious and active area of historical and legal discussion, with no simple, universally accepted answer. Strong arguments exist on both sides, often hinging on interpretations of intent and the available evidence. What is clear, however, is the sheer scale of the human-made catastrophe, a tragedy of almost unimaginable proportions, regardless of the precise legal or academic label ultimately applied to it.
Finally, let's consider the enduring legacy of this incredibly dark period. Beyond the direct horrors and the demographic catastrophe, what were the long-term impacts on the Congo itself and on Leopold's image, both historically and perhaps more importantly, in contemporary society?
The immediate practical impact on the Congo was profound and long-lasting. The devastating population decline and the widespread social disruption led directly to a severe labor shortage for the subsequent Belgian colonial government, particularly as they tried to pivot towards mining and plantation agriculture. This necessitated, or was used to justify, mass migrations of people, often forced, to new areas to provide workers for emerging colonial businesses, further disrupting traditional life.
And Leopold's image, how did that fare?
Leopold's image remains deeply contested and incredibly polarizing even today. It wasn't universally positive, even at the time of his death. Belgian crowds famously booed at his funeral procession in 1909, expressing immediate public dissatisfaction, likely fueled by the Congo scandals as well as domestic politics. Poets like the American Vachel Lindsay quickly memorialized the atrocities, writing lines like "burning in hell for his hand-maimed host" in his famous, if somewhat racially charged, poem The Congo, published just a few years later.
And his statues, which were initially erected to glorify him, have become a poignant and powerful focal point of modern reckoning, especially in recent years.
Exactly. Numerous statues of Leopold II were erected across Belgium, mostly in the 1930s, decades after his death, during a period of heightened colonial triumphalism. They celebrated his supposed accomplishments as the Builder King and often portrayed him as a benevolent civilizer bringing progress to Africa.
But that narrative is crumbling now.
Being fiercely challenged. These statues have become lightning rods for protest, symbols of colonial oppression and racism. They were largely relocated or removed in the Congo itself after independence in 1960, although one was briefly, controversially reinstated in Kinshasa in 2005, only to be taken down again quickly after public outcry.
And in Belgium.
More recently, particularly in 2020, following the murder of George Floyd in the U.S. and a global wave of Black Lives Matter protests against racial injustice, numerous statues of Leopold II across Belgium were targeted. They were vandalized, defaced, covered in red paint to symbolize the red rubber atrocities, and sparked widespread calls from activists and the public for their permanent removal from public spaces.
Has that happened?
Some have been removed, others remain, often sparking counter-petitions arguing for their preservation as historical artifacts, perhaps with added contextual information. It highlights an ongoing, often painful national conversation in Belgium about how to confront its colonial past and Leopold's specific brutal legacy.
And the Belgian monarchy itself has had to address this, albeit cautiously, and it seems like an ongoing process of confronting a difficult past.
Indeed. The pressure has reached the very top. On June 30th, 2020, which marked the 60th anniversary of Congolese independence, the current King Philip of Belgium took a significant step. He sent a letter to the Congolese president, Felix Tshisekedi.
What did the letter say?
In it, King Philip expressed his deepest regret. Those were his specific words for the acts of violence and cruelty committed during the Congo Free State period and also during the subsequent era of formal Belgian colonial rule. He acknowledged the suffering and humiliation caused by this past.
Was it seen as a full apology?
Not quite, and that's where the criticism came in. While it was a historic and unprecedented statement from a reigning Belgian monarch, he notably did not explicitly mention his ancestor Leopold II's personal role in initiating and driving the atrocities, nor did he offer a full, unequivocal apology on behalf of the monarchy or the Belgian state for the actions committed.
So, regret, but not apology.
Precisely. This led to criticism from some activists, historians, and members of the Congolese diaspora who felt it didn't go far enough in acknowledging the specific historical accountability, particularly Leopold's, and didn't address the ongoing calls for reparations. It's a clear indication that Belgium, as a nation and institutionally, is still grappling deeply with how to fully confront and reconcile with its colonial past, a process that is clearly far from over.
And one final sobering point from the outline, the term Congolese genocide, is sometimes used today in a different context.
Yes, tragically, the term Congolese genocide or similar phrases are also sometimes used by activists and commentators to refer to the horrific mass killings, systemic rape, and widespread violence that occurred much more recently in the eastern regions of the Democratic Republic of Congo, particularly during the Second Congo War, roughly 1998-2003, and its ongoing aftermath. While the historical context, perpetrators, and specific dynamics are different, the use of such strong language emphasizes that patterns of extreme violence, resource exploitation, and immense human suffering have unfortunately recurred in the region, echoing some of the darkest chapters of its past.
What an incredibly dense, difficult, and profoundly important history we've tried to unpack today. It's really quite overwhelming when you lay it all out.
It truly is. The scale, the systematic nature of the cruelty, it's hard to comprehend.
We've seen Leopold's singular, relentless ambition, how the global rubber boom acted as the catalyst for extreme, systemic exploitation, transforming a failing venture into a machine of horror.
The profit motive driving it all.
And the multifaceted causes of that catastrophic population decline: direct violence, yes, but also devastating disease and famine, all interacting in a horrific, man-made dance of death.
A deadly synergy created by the system itself.
And of course, the complex, sensitive, and still ongoing debate over whether these atrocities, by strict definition, constitute a genocide.
A debate that forces us to think hard about definitions, intent, and how we categorize unimaginable suffering.
It's a period that demands our sustained attention, doesn't it? Not just for the sheer scale of suffering, which is staggering, but for the chillingly bureaucratic and economic mechanisms that allowed it to unfold and persist for so long.
Absolutely. Understanding the specific drivers of this tragedy, the pursuit of profit elevated above all else, the calculated dehumanization required to sustain it, the dangers of unchecked personal power fused with state authority helps us move beyond simple narratives of just evil. It helps us grasp the full horror, yes, but also the profound historical nuances involved. It forces us to confront some very uncomfortable truths about what humans and systems are capable of when greed is unchecked.
Absolutely. This deep dive into the Congo Free State reveals, I think, a devastating and timeless truth. How unchecked power, especially when fueled by boundless, insatiable greed, can systematically create human suffering on an almost unimaginable scale. It really makes you wonder. Given the detailed mechanisms of control and profit that fueled the Congo Free State, the concession companies, the quotas, the justification of civilizing while exploiting, what profound lessons might this history hold for us today, particularly in how we evaluate perhaps our own global supply chains, resource extraction practices, and the human rights implications that might be hidden deep within our complex, interconnected modern world?
That's a profound and truly necessary question, isn't it? One that resonates far beyond the specific historical context of the Congo, prompting us to examine our own present with perhaps more critical eyes. A vital lesson indeed.
Thank you for joining us on the deep dive. We hope this exploration, however difficult, has provided you with a deeper, more nuanced, and perhaps unsettling understanding of this crucial yet often tragically overlooked chapter in human history. Until next time.